Joyce, I suppose, might seem like a strange choice to refer to when we're talking about demystifying the cost of environmental justice. Because, as you're all aware, Joyce, James Joyce, is first and foremost an urban writer. All his revolutionary creations, Dubliners, Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, Exiles, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, they all centre on Dublin, the native city. And it's not just that he uses Dublin as a setting or as an imaginative backdrop, it's the city itself that his characters are situated in, that they walk around. And that city for Joyce is the site of the modern and his radical vision for the future. But Joyce was also profoundly aware of and fascinated by law. The late Adrian Hardiman, Justice of the Supreme Court, was finishing a book on Joyce in court when at the time of his untimely death. But it was finished posthumously. And Adrian Hardiman noted that in Ulysses alone, there were 18 legal cases referred to, as well as specifically named an assortment of barristers, solicitors, public figures involved in the various proceedings. And Joyce's urbanism was central, as I've said, and with his references to Dear Dirty Dublin, that might seem to be at odds with today's launch, environmentalism and environmental justice, as very often we're concerned with the rescue and preservation of the natural environment. But it might be more pressing for us to be aware of the urban and the degraded and the polluted landscapes and how they are dealt with. I'm reminded that the former president of Iceland, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, who's now chair of the International Renewable Energy Agency's Global Commission on the Geopolitics of Energy Transformation, in a lecture to a conference of European employment lawyers in Reykjavik in June this year, made the profound comment that it is in dealing with the energy needs to cool and heat the large cities of this world that the planet will be lost or saved. So Joyce, therefore, I think, is a very appropriate setting, set as he was in the sullied slums and the back streets of Dublin, occupied by the poor and the outcasts in the modern metropolis. And one of the cases, those 18 cases that Joyce refers to, was a notorious water dispute of the time, where Dublin Corporation sued the Dublin Union, which ran the poorhouse, about the excessive consumption of water. And that case was ongoing in June of 2004. And as you're all aware, Bloomsday was the traverse in Ulysses of the city of Dublin, and the happenings on the 16th of June 1904. But more of that anon. We do realise that fundamental to Joyce's work is the River Liffey flowing through Dublin. And Joyce's characters confronted the major issues around water, which they might not at that time have termed environmental issues, but they are familiar to us today. And he also refers to, in Ulysses, issues such as air pollution, waste removal, and in particular the clean drinking water for the city of Dublin. And the centrality of the sewer system is, in fact, a backdrop in Ulysses for a very interesting passage in the Ithaca section. And Leopold Bloom makes reference to the Dublin water system, also known as the Vartry scheme at that time, which was a massive public works project and was considered at the time one of the highest civil engineering and public health achievements in Dublin, if not in Europe. So for those of you not familiar, the Vartry reservoir scheme, from which we still get our clean water in Dublin today, that involved the partial redirection and damming of the Vartry River, the building of a series of water, piping and filtering systems to carry fresh water to the city. This was needed because the water provision in Dublin had begun by the middle of the 18th century to lead to very serious problems and under-provision. Much of the population at that time were relying on water drawn from the canals and provided by the canal companies. And while that was free, it was certainly not of the cleanest. And as a result, the Vartry scheme was developed to bring water into the city centre. And this was done between 1862 and 1868. And there was an earthen dam constructed across the River Vartry, and it was done by a Dublin Waterworks Committee established to get the necessary legislation passed and bring water into Dublin and the suburbs. And it was a particularly important improvement in the living conditions and public health in Dublin city, because prior to that, the lack of public sanitation had meant that there were outbreaks of cholera, typhus, and other diseases associated with contaminated water. And one of those who fell foul of typhoid and succumbed was in fact none other than Gerald Manley Hopkins, that stalwart of the Leaving Cert poetry cycle, who died of typhoid at the time. And you will see references also in Joyce to the impact of the still poor sanitation. He talks about the oysters in and around Onleary, about the cockle picking in Sandymount Strand, and moreover the effects on people's stomachs of picking cockles and oysters, which were less than healthy. But in any event, the Vartry scheme was a very costly endeavour, which meant then that water had to be financed by a charge for water. And it was a very tightly controlled business run by the Corporation of Dublin. This is all mentioned as background to Leopold Bloom in chapter 17 of James Joyce's Ulysses, if you want to go and look that up. And Bloom gives a very thoughtful digression on his household water supply, and at the same time digresses then into the 1904 legal dispute over water usage. So what was the background to that dispute? Well, as I've said, as a result of this Vartry scheme, domestic water usage was monitored by city engineer Spencer Harry, who's named expressly in the Ithaca passage of Ulysses. The engineer and his team of inspectors had the task of verifying that householders stayed within the prescribed limit by ensuring that all homes were equipped with regulation half-inch fittings. And this was to replace the previous fittings, many of which had been there since medieval times, where water was running through elm, birch and willow pipes, seeping into the alluvial soil of Dublin, leading to much water loss. The new scheme then, while a considerable improvement, did not mean that shortages did not occur. And in particular, there was a shortage during 1904, during which the corporation set a daily ration of 18 gallons per person for domestic use. Everybody in Dublin at the time would have felt the impact of such a required cutback in usage, and that is referenced in Ulysses itself. However, there was one particular body, the South Dublin Guardian, which operated the South Dublin Union, a workhouse and a residence for the area's poor. That this South Dublin Guardian, a charitable organisation, paid little heed to the law, to the restrictions, to the water supply and to the payment for water. And even though they had negotiated a favourable rate, they continued paying little heed and thumbing their nose to the restrictions imposed by Dublin Corporation and the inspectors. As a result, the case commenced of Dublin Corporation against the South Dublin Union. In spring 1904, Dublin Corporation accused South Dublin Union of overconsumption at the workhouse by maintaining a 6-inch pipe from as early as 1898. They filed suit to collect damages for what they called excessive use. And for their part, the Guardians countered that a half-inch pipe, which although sufficient was sufficient for households, was an insufficient allocation to the 3,000 to 4,000 what were termed paupers in residence in the workhouse at the time. The case was heard initially by the Lord Chief Baron and the judges of the King's Bench, and ultimately reached the Court of Appeal in the first week of June 1904, the date at which Leopold Bloom's Traverse of the City is set. And the Irish Daily Independent reported, after 3 days of argument in court, that a ruling had been reached. And it's not clear as to whether this was by way of settlement or by court of direction, that a ruling was made after 3 days of argument directing that the Guardians, this charitable organisation, pay the corporation for damages to be calculated on the difference between the amount allowed for domestic use and the answer actually being ascertained by the meterage. The period to be calculated from the 1st of January 1898 to the present date, which was a period of 8 years of damages and arrears. And the ruling stated that the settlement was to be carried out without prejudice to the future rights of the parties. And the reports in the Irish Independent note that presiding judge, Judge Gibson, did seek, as many judges still do today, to establish the cooperation of parties into the future by suggesting that it would be a good thing if the corporation and the Guardians, by a small committee of 3 or 4 gentlemen on each side, would have a conference and to try and adjust the matter for the future. I don't know how that went. But it is interesting, in line with all of the talks that we had earlier on today in the aisle sessions when we were talking about strategic litigation, and the fact that the communications and the social media and the newspaper afterwards can be just as important in strategic litigation cases. That, in fact, in 1904, the same issues arose, because even after the verdict was in, the two sides continued to argue the case in the court of public opinion, and in particular to complain about the legal costs of the action. In a letter to the editor of the Irish Independent on the 10th of June 1904, Gerald Fitzgerald, who was in fact the solicitor for the South Dublin Union Guardians, that charitable organisation, he criticised the coverage of the case in the paper, and he complained that it gave a false impression of what he termed very costly litigation between the corporation and the defendants. And bear in mind, the solicitor, Gerald Fitzgerald, was solicitor at that point for a charitable organisation. He said that the total costs of the litigation was £1,200 to the corporation in order to recoup damages from the Guardians in the amount of £700 for excess water consumption. And the legal battle continued in the newspaper, where the corporation's law agent, Mr. Ignatius Rice, he countered that the Guardians had put the entire city water supply at risk through their actions in failing to adhere to the corporation's laws on water resources. And Ignatius Rice's response referred in the newspaper to the notions of guardianship, public responsibility, civic authority, stating that the corporation was the guardians of the public water supply, and that if other public bodies and persons were to act as the Guardians had done, supply to the inhabitants would be seriously injured, as well as supplies to the corporation for public purposes and for the townships. We could write these things today. The conflict between notions of public responsibility, public good, set on one side, and a charitable organisation on the other. We therefore see, I think, in Joyce, debates relevant, very relevant to us today, whether it is worse to overuse public water to support the poor, or is it worse to squander taxpayers' money in litigation? And Joyce depicts this controversy around sound management of water supply as raising fundamental questions about not only the political and ecological use of water in cities, but also about the costs of litigation and the costs-benefit analysis of enforcing environmental laws, although he naturally didn't term them in exactly those words. And moving to today, I think we realise that not only clean water, but that all resources are a public good. And there is a debate as to who is to ensure that these public goods are preserved, and who is to take on the enforcement of the existing environmental laws that we have. And these questions about what to do around the allocation of these public goods, and what to do when bodies seem, whether charitable or private parties, seem to be thumbing their nose at the law brought in to ensure the public good. And we also see similar issues arise as to whether the enforcement should be taken by public authorities, and are they going to be criticised for so doing if the costs of the enforcement action outweighs the damages obtained at the end. So bringing us up to date and to the context of today's launch of the handbook on the costs of environmental justice on the island of Ireland, I want to refer us back to the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity, which reported in 2023, and which I quote in the afterword to the Costs Handbook. And the recommendation number 2 of the Citizens' Assembly is very scathing. It said, "This Assembly believes that the state has comprehensively failed to adequately fund, implement and enforce the existing national legislation, national policies, EU biodiversity-related laws and directives related to biodiversity. This must change." So how are we to finance the necessary litigation to enforce environmental law? And no more than in Joyce's time, we are left with a public debate as to how to enforce, who should enforce, and who should pay for the litigation involved. One thing is clear at the present time: the enforcement is not happening. Still today, public authorities are under-resourced and on occasion perhaps criticised for using taxpayers' money to engage in prosecutions and enforcement actions. And this was referred to by Mr. Justice Collins last Friday at a conference organised by the EPA and the ICEL. And he stated that where the costs of bringing enforcement actions are very high for local authorities which are under-resourced, so enforcement has to be taken by private parties, if by private parties or not at all. And therefore, if we look and say that some of the slack of enforcement of environmental law has to be undertaken by public bodies, we must therefore face up very squarely to the financing of that litigation. Experts have to be paid for. Scientific reports have to be commissioned. The lawyer is also worth his wage. And this handbook, which I commend to you, casts a clear eye on the legal costs, north and south, and it identifies many of the barriers, north and south, which prevent private parties from bringing necessary litigation. And there is no doubt that there will be ongoing controversy, no more than there was in Joyce's time, about the necessity for resorting to litigation. And indeed, the writers of the handbook are very clear to say they do not wish to encourage unnecessary litigation. But however, there will always be environmental disputes. There will be always those who do not adhere to the law. And there will also always be a need for enforcement. So in this handbook, therefore, which Ciara Brennan is going to talk about in more detail shortly, by looking north and south, it allows both jurisdictions to shine a light on each other and thereby learn in the best traditions of comparative law. We see from the handbook that in Northern Ireland, third-party funding is permitted for environmental actions, and civil legal aid for environmental actions is permitted, even if it is limited. However, there is a prohibition in Northern Ireland on contingent fee, or what we might call no foal, no fee, which, as I understand, is a practice rather than a legislative prohibition. By contrast, in the South, there is no civil legal aid for environmental actions, and it is noted in studies done by the board, the Civil Legal Aid Board, that they are not permitted, or the board is not permitted, to provide legal aid for matters which are of benefit to the public rather than an individual. Litigation funding is not permitted here in the South, other than in very unusual circumstances, because it is contrary to the medieval doctrines of champerty and maintenance. There are also difficulties, both north and south, with class actions, which are a vital method of spreading the costs of litigation amongst a wider group of plaintiffs. And the handbook has various recommendations, which we urge on all of those present, many of which will require legislative reforms, but many of which can be done outside legislation. So, to conclude, as in Joyce's time, still today, we do need clean water, and there is still a debate on how that should be paid for. But we also, today, we do need litigation, to be able to resort to litigation to enforce environmental law and to achieve environmental justice. But again, then as now, nobody wants to pay for it. Thank you very much.